The notification came up on my phone while I was standing in the driveway, scraping ice off the windshield of my truck. It was a Thursday morning in late February, the kind of cold that gets into your knuckles and stays there. I'd been retired for almost 2 years by then, and most mornings I had nowhere particular to be. But my oldest friend had texted me the night before, asked if I wanted to drive out to Wasaga Beach, walk the strip, grab breakfast at that diner we used to go to back in the 70s. I said sure. I was looking forward to it. The notification wasn't from him. It was from my wife's tablet. She had it synced to the family account we set up years ago to share photos with the kids. I'd forgotten the thing was even connected to my phone. But there it was, a calendar alert that had pushed through to my device by mistake. Or maybe not by mistake. I'm still not entirely sure how it happened, and I've stopped trying to figure it out. The alert said, Roger, Wednesday. Same place. That was all. I stood there in the driveway with the ice scraper in my hand for a long time, long enough that my fingers went numb and I didn't notice. My wife and I had been married for 31 years. We met at a company picnic in Barrie. She was there with a colleague. I was there with my brother. She laughed at something my brother said, and I thought, whoever that woman is, she is the kind of person I want to be around for the rest of my life. 7 months later, we were engaged. The following spring, we got married at a small church in Collingwood, 20 minutes from where she grew up. We raised 2 kids in a split level on a quiet street in Orillia. Our son is in Sudbury now, works in mining operations. Our daughter lives in Barrie, teaches elementary school, has 3 kids of her own. I thought I knew my life. Roger was someone she worked with before she retired. She'd retired 14 months before this moment. I knew who he was. I'd met him at a couple of work events over the years. He coached recreational hockey on weekends, she'd mentioned that once. He drove a silver Silverado. That's the full extent of what I knew about him. I didn't cancel my plans with my friend. I went to Wasaga Beach. I ate eggs and toast and drank 2 cups of coffee. I talked about hockey and whether the Leafs would ever stop breaking our hearts. I laughed at the right moments. On the drive home, I kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and I thought about the fact that Wednesday, same place, meant this was not the first time. A calendar entry isn't a one-night mistake. A mistake is locking your keys in the car. A mistake is overcooking the roast. 11 months, a calendar entry, and a first name you recognize. That's not a mistake. That's a schedule. I want to be clear about something, because I think people hear a story like this, and they assume the person in my position must have been oblivious, must have missed something obvious. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I'm 63 years old and I have spent 3 decades with the same woman, and I thought I understood the texture of our life together. If there were signs, they weren't things I could have pointed to and named. She seemed a little quieter in the fall. I thought it was the adjustment to retirement. She started going to a yoga class on Wednesday mornings. I thought that was good. She'd always meant to do something like that once she stopped working. Wednesday mornings. Same place. I didn't say anything to her that night, or the night after. I'm not sure what I was waiting for. Maybe I was hoping I'd find an explanation that made sense. A Roger who was a cousin I'd forgotten about. A same place that was entirely innocent. I'm not a suspicious person by nature. I'm the kind of man who gives people the benefit of the doubt, because I genuinely believe most people deserve it. I checked the tablet. I don't feel good about that. But I did it. There were messages. Not a huge volume of them. They'd been careful, or careful enough, but enough. The kind of messages that don't leave any room for interpretation. I read them once. I didn't need to read them twice. What I felt wasn't the thing people expect you to feel. I didn't feel rage, not right away. What I felt was something closer to disorientation, like standing in a room you've lived in for 30 years and suddenly not recognizing anything in it. Like the walls had moved 6 inches while you weren't looking, and now nothing quite lines up the way you remember. I closed the tablet. I went back to the living room. She was watching something on television. She looked up and asked if I wanted tea, and I said no thanks and sat down and watched whatever she was watching, and I did not say a single word. That went on for almost 3 weeks. I called my GP during that time and asked to speak to someone. I wasn't in crisis. I want to be precise about that. I just knew enough about myself to know I needed to talk to a person who wasn't inside the situation. The therapist I saw told me I was being very measured. I didn't take that as a compliment exactly. It was more that I didn't know what else to be. I also called a lawyer. My brother-in-law had gone through a divorce about 6 years prior, and he'd mentioned a woman in Barrie Said she was thorough and straightforward and didn't drag things out unnecessarily. I made an appointment and I went. I told her the basic outline of things. She walked me through what a separation would look like, what I was entitled to, what the process generally involved. We live in Ontario. The family home, the RRSPs, the pension, all of it had to be considered. It was a lot of information to absorb. I took notes. When I got home, she was in the kitchen making soup. The house smelled like it always does in winter, wood from the fireplace, whatever she's cooking, the particular smell of a house you've lived in for a long time. I sat down at the kitchen table and I watched her for a moment, and I thought about 31 years, and I thought about the calendar notification, and I thought about the messages on the tablet, and I said, "How long has it been going on with Roger?" She didn't drop anything, she didn't gasp. She turned around slowly and looked at me, and I could see immediately that some part of her was almost relieved, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone had just offered to set it down. She said, "How did you find out?" I told her about the calendar notification. She sat down across from me. She didn't cry right away, but her hands were shaking slightly. She said it had started about 8 months after she retired. She said she hadn't planned it, that it grew out of something that started as just lunch between former colleagues. She said she knew that wasn't an excuse. I said, 8 months. So what? Almost 2 years. She said, about that, yes. I want to tell you what I said back, but the truth is I didn't say anything for a while. I just sat there. 2 years is a long time. 2 years means she sat across from me at this kitchen table probably 500 or 600 times and looked at me and knew what she was doing and kept doing it. 2 years means Christmas and our anniversary in June and the summer we drove out to Prince Edward Island with the grandkids. 2 years is not a lapse in judgment. 2 years is a decision, renewed over and over again, every Wednesday morning when she got in her car and drove to wherever it was they went. I said, "I'd like you to move out for a while." She said she didn't want to do that. She said she wanted to work on things. She said what happened was a reflection of how lost she'd felt since retiring, that she'd lost her sense of identity, and she'd made a terrible choice and she wanted to fix it. She said she still loved me. She said she'd end it with him immediately if I wanted her to. I said, "I think you should stay with your sister until we've talked to lawyers." She started crying then. She said she didn't want to lose our life together. She said 31 years meant something and she didn't want to throw that away. I understood what she was saying. I even believed her, in a way. I think she meant it. I think people can mean things and still have done what she did. Those aren't mutually exclusive. What I couldn't get past was the 2 years. Not the fact of what she'd done, though that was its own thing, but the length of it, the sustained nature of it. The way she'd looked at me across 600 dinners and known, and continued, and come home and made soup and asked if I wanted tea. I called my son that night. That was one of the hardest phone calls I've ever made. He's 41 years old, and he's seen things. He works in a hard industry, in a hard part of the province. But his voice went very quiet when I told him. He said he was sorry. He asked if I was okay. I said I was managing. He said he'd come down that weekend if I needed him to. I said I appreciated that. My daughter was harder. She and her mother are very close. When I told her, she cried, and then she got angry. And the anger wasn't entirely directed at her mother. Some of it came toward me. She said I should have given her mother a chance to explain before going straight to the lawyer. She said maybe there was more to the story than I was hearing. She said sometimes things are complicated, and people don't always understand what's happening inside a marriage from the outside. I let her say all of that. Then I said, I do understand what was happening inside our marriage. I was inside it. 2 years is not complicated. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said she just didn't want to see the family fall apart. I told her the family wasn't falling apart, that her mother and I were separating, but that I was still her father and she was still my daughter and none of that was changing. I told her the grandkids weren't going to lose their grandfather. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She cried a little more, and then she said she needed time to process things, and I said, of course, take all the time you need. What happened next is the part I didn't expect. About a week after my wife moved to her sister's, I got a call from my brother-in-law. Not the one who'd gone through the divorce, her brother, the other one. He's a man I've always had a decent relationship with. We've watched hockey together, gone fishing a few times, spent 20-something Christmases at the same table. I considered him something close to a genuine friend. He called to tell me that the family felt I was being too hasty. That's the word he used, hasty. He said that, at our age after this many years, it would be a shame to throw everything away over what he called a lapse. He said he understood I was hurt. He acknowledged that directly. I'll give him that. But he said my wife was genuinely remorseful, and he hoped I would find it in me to consider reconciliation. I said, she did this for 2 years. He said he knew that. I said, she drove to meet him while I was here, while we were living our life. He said he knew that too. But he said people make mistakes. He said she was his sister and he knew her heart, and he believed she was a good person who had done a bad thing, and he hoped I wouldn't define her by the worst thing she'd ever done. I thought about that for a second. Then I said, I'm not defining her. I'm just deciding what I'm willing to live with. He didn't have much to say after that. I heard from her sister as well, a few days later. More gentle than the brother, but the same general direction. She hoped we could find a way through this. She said my wife was devastated. She said 31 years was worth fighting for. I thanked her for calling and said I'd let them know if anything changed. What I kept thinking about was a phrase I'd heard somewhere, maybe I read it, I can't remember. That said something like, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. I don't know if I agree with that entirely, but there's something in it. What wore me down wasn't only what she'd done. It was the ordinary Tuesday evenings when she'd asked about my day and listened to my answer, and then told me about hers. The small coordinated deception of everyday life continued for 24 months. I could imagine forgiving a moment of weakness, a single terrible choice, immediately regretted, immediately confessed. What I couldn't do was look back at 2 years of shared mornings and meals and conversations and trust them anymore. They'd been redefined, not by me. The separation agreement took about 5 months to finalize. Our lawyers communicated mostly. We had one meeting in person, just the two of us, no lawyers present, at a coffee shop on Dunlop Street that we'd been going to since the 90s. She looked tired. I imagine I did too. She said she was sorry. She said it more than once. I believe she meant it. I told her I didn't hate her. That's true, I don't. What I feel is something more like a kind of careful distance. Like standing far enough back from something that used to be important, so that it can't reach you anymore. The house sold in the spring. We split the proceeds. The RRSPs were divided as per the agreement. My pension was assessed and accounted for. It was all handled correctly and without a great deal of conflict, which I'm grateful for. I ended up buying a smaller place just outside of Penetanguishene, close enough to my daughter in Barrie that I can get to the grandkids in about 40 minutes, close enough to the water that in the summer I can hear the bay if the wind is right. My son came down for 2 weeks in July. We went fishing 4 days in a row and didn't catch much, and it didn't matter. My daughter brings the grandkids to see me most Sunday afternoons. She and I talked properly about a month after everything was settled. Really talked. The kind of conversation that takes a couple of hours and leaves you tired in a useful way. She said she'd been scared. I understood that. I told her I had been too, but that scared wasn't the same as wrong. She said, "How are you actually?" I thought about that. It wasn't a question I'd been asked very directly very often. I said, "I'm okay. I'm more okay than I expected to be." And that was true. I'm 63 years old. I have a small house that's mine. I have a dock that needs work and a truck that runs, and 2 grandchildren who call me on FaceTime without warning to show me things they found in the backyard. I wake up in the morning and the day is entirely mine to decide what to do with. That's not nothing. I'm not going to tell you this didn't cost me something. It did. 31 years is a long time, and there are moments, usually early in the morning, before the day starts, when I feel the weight of what's been lost. Not regret exactly, something more honest than that. Grief, maybe, for the version of the life I thought I had. But I also know this. I sat across from my brother-in-law, and I listened to him tell me to be patient and measured and consider reconciliation. And I understood that what he was really asking me to do was make my life smaller so that everyone else could be more comfortable. And I'm too old for that. I've worked too long and paid too much, and I know too well how short the remaining years are to spend them managing someone else's guilt. My friend from Wasaga Beach asked me recently how I was holding up. We were sitting in the same diner, same corner booth, eggs and toast again. He'd been through his own hard things over the years, I won't go into them, and he has a way of asking questions that means he actually wants to know the answer. I said, "I think I'm where I'm supposed to be." He nodded, looked out the window at the parking lot, said, "That's further along than most people get." We drove home along the lake, and the ice was just starting to break up along the shore. Those big gray-blue slabs shifting and settling. It looked cold, and also somehow like something beginning. I turned the radio on.